Um, Looking back again at some of your assignments and stories, and maybe just generally with the different types that you were talking about that you covered, can you think of some big ethical dilemmas that you've had as far as what to cover and what not to?
I don't know. I think on a day-to-day basis there was always something. Actually, there's so many of these things that I could probably remember 65 of them if given enough months. But this one came up just the other day. I do specifically remember a time when a public official got her third DUI, and we covered it up. I was furious, and I did one of my classic, let them know I was furious, slammed the phone down, and walk out of the room. And all people remember now is that I slammed the phone down and left the room. They don't know why I did it, because it was hypocritical and wrong. And but compare and contrast this to a world kind of where we are today, where if a teacher gets a misdemeanor, it's in the newspaper. So the newspapers and the media does cover up. The question is, what do they cover up? There were many stories where the editors would squelch a story for this or that reason, and we would never understand why. Usually it was a harmless thing that they were trying to squelch. Like, for example, maybe we were on top of a story that said, using this Dollywood thing that they're coming. We might have had the story before the Dolly people were ready to announce it, and the mayor would call the newspaper editor and say, let's not break this because they want to have a big press conference and have a big splash. And the newspaper editor would keep it from being in the paper. And this happened with a big story involving HCA's headquarters. They wouldn't let us write it for a week, even though we knew. There was a lot of that kind of thing. And it did make it hard. I mean, people always say, Bill, choose your battles. But there seemed like there was a lot of battles. And sometimes it felt like the people who were the happiest in the newsroom were those who were just blissfully ignorant of the battles. There weren't enough reporters to even dig up the stories in the first place. So, but I do remember the DUI thing, particularly, because it wasn't her first; it was her third, which is a serious offense in Tennessee.
Right. You kind of hit on the internet a little bit, and there's been some kind of discussion of people that are non-professionals, bloggers, and people, mojos and mobile journalists and that kind of thing, who are just either doing it for their blog or not really being paid. What do you think maybe some of the disadvantages of the prevalence of blogging, and maybe what can a blogger not really be able to do that somebody that's experienced in journalism can do?
Well, a blogger can do anything, and Lord, some bloggers have broken some huge stories. And while I should also point out that a journalist isn't, as far as like, I never took a college course on how to be a journalist. So as far as being a professional, what I'm talking about though is, using as a classic example the legislature. There's a zillion people with opinions as to what goes on down there, but when you go down, no one is sitting in those meetings anymore. And so you just have people blogging about this or that, but they're not actually sitting in on the meetings. I remember this story. This actually happened. There was a senator from Memphis named Curtis Person. And about 1998, I was down there talking to some of the reporters, and he walked in, and I looked at my watch, and I said, it's 3:30, why aren't you in your committee meeting? In fact, it was like 3:45, and he goes, there's no reporters down there. And I said, so? And he goes, how come y'all don't cover my meeting no more? And it was the Senate Judiciary Committee. Well, because your damn meeting's too long, Senator. But what happened is the banner had gone away a couple years earlier, and basically, make a long story short, we had gone from having 5 or 6 reporters actually sitting through all those meetings to having 0 in only 2 years. And there may be some of the people that try to watch it on TV now, but other than lobbyists, no one is actually following that stuff. And so, so the understanding of the process among the general public has probably gone down, I think. But bloggers can do just about anything a reporter can do, I suppose. And I'm not necessarily saying but I think a world of blogging, the problem is it just gives you so much information as a reader, you have no idea who's telling the truth. I certainly don't believe anything I read on the internet just based on the fact that it's on the internet. And so you have no way of knowing, I guess.
Right, because I guess that a newspaper or a news programming, at least that's somebody saying this is a body that approves this message, kind of. And where if you're a blogger, you kind of only have that individual sense, maybe, right?
I mean, give you something, a harmless thing. My wife and I were coming back from East Tennessee, and there was a horrible, horrible wreck. And we got stuck for like 2 hours, and we drove by, and it was something bad. Somebody got killed. Some children got killed. Came home, and it took me several hours on the phone to figure out what had happened, because news media no longer covers wrecks. Now, you might say, well, I mean, I know this sounds stupid, but I even talked to the Department of Transportation. How come y'all don't have a website that at least says this happened? But the Cookeville newspaper didn't cover it, and I think part of this had to do with the fact that the Tennessean has bought up all the newspapers in the immediate area and then shut them all down, like in Gallatin and Lebanon. But just simple things that used to be in the paper aren't in the paper. And that's, bloggers aren't doing that. So.
Right. What do you think, looking back not only to your Tennessean experience, but also at the scene and other places, and those might all kind of combine together, but what do you think are some of your most significant contributions to Nashville and journalism here?
I think my most significant contribution to Nashville is now this educational thing I do with Tennessee History for Kids. It has to do with the fact that they have de-emphasized the teaching of social studies and civics so much that it's not hardly being taught at all. And one of the reasons it's not being taught is that they don't really have textbooks on local and state history. We created this online thing, and we can't get all the teachers to do it, but many of them do, and somewhere in the range of 6,000 teachers in the state do use it. And that's, the audience is not old, rich people anymore, but I've had kids run up to me in Knoxville and recognize me as History Bill, the history guy. So I think that's, if something had to go on my tombstone, it would probably be that. I've done a bunch of books, and a couple that I'm particularly proud of, but I've done a couple books that we printed 20 copies of. So I've had a couple books that were read slightly more than a master's thesis, but I think it would probably be the education side of it.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about, we've talked actually a lot about the good and the bad of what's happened in the past, but if you kind of, again, kind of specifically, we've talked a lot about the bad, I guess, of the lack of journalism in the legislature and the way that things have gone down. Have you seen maybe good changes in Nashville's reporting, and maybe that's in a certain sector, maybe that's in business or somewhere else?
I know you don't want to hear. I really haven't, and I don't mean to. I don't necessarily think it's the fault of anyone. I just think that by de-emphasizing the value of journalism, it's really become something that's free, and it's kind of moved down that direction. I think what concerns me the most is just what's not being reported anymore, and it's not all sensational, scandalous stuff. I will say this: for me, the most interesting, uplifting story about journalism of the last whatever is that small town newspapers that are some distance from cities still exist and have not been bought up and shut down. But for example, a place like Shelbyville still has a newspaper, Dyersburg or some, and they operate it very much the way they always have. But at the other extreme, a place like Gallatin has seen their newspaper bought up and shut down, and it's been horrifying to see what's happened. I teach at a public, I don't know, I told you this, I have two jobs. I teach at a public high school. The best known high school teacher in Sumner County retired last month. 43 years in the community teaching, won national awards. It was not in the newspaper for 2 months until I called them, and then they did a big story on him. Well, it's a good thing I called, and so now it's, I mean, but the reporters have got to start cultivating more relationships in the community. They've got to start meeting people. They've got to stop being so horribly arrogant. I called the Tennessean a few weeks ago, and they made a really big mistake in a story. And first they argue with me about it. It's an area which I know a lot, so they were wrong, I was right. But they never corrected it. And it was a big deal. It was a story that implied that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in Tennessee. It didn't. And since there's no other newspaper, in the old days, the other newspaper would have ridiculed them for getting it wrong. Now they just perpetuate the incorrectness, and so they never did correct it. They don't correct anything anymore, and that's so. I think on a national scale, which I don't think as much about Washington D.C., but I'm sure there's similar problems. But I'm hopeful. I will say this: a city of 1 million people will always have to have some kind of newspaper. But I do think we may wake up one day and it won't be the Tennessee anymore. I really think that one day they may just go bankrupt, and then we'll start from scratch again.
Right. Maybe we'll have a little bit more competition at that point.
Well, I just hope, yeah. But I teach a public. Here's the thing: I teach a public high school, and my kids brag because they don't read. I'll say, "Did y'all see that story in the paper?" "We don't read, Mr. Carey." And I say, "Don't say that." But they say that. And they're not kidding. So I'm a little concerned about that. 51 students, 0 of the 51 could tell me who was president between 1993 and 2001. This is a cross between a news thing and a history thing. They've never heard of Bill Clinton. And I had heard of Lyndon Johnson when I was their age. So that concerns me a little bit, because they're just not they're not, because of the decline of newspapers, they're being raised unaware of what it means to be an American, and that should concern people.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that argue that, especially with the internet, that news just needs to be covered more with video, and that's the way to get people to watch and get people to tune into the news. Do you think there's still, whether the newspaper is in a print version or online or however it goes, do you think there's still value in, or what do you think the value is in having the newspaper, something that you can read instead of just something that you watch?
I think the main value is that the world of advertising still wants something you can hold, and I can promise you that because it's in my mailbox right now. The junk mail is still maybe more prevalent than it was. So that being the case, the advertising dollar still wants something, still wants that, and so, but I certainly hope so.